Hi, Year 9. Welcome to week 3, lesson 2. So, like I said before, we're going to talk a little bit about the stolen generation because it really does impact Ali Cobby Eckermann's writing. Um, it's impossible to read her work without trying to understand some of the past that is associated with it. Just a quick shout out to those people who do have an Indigenous background that the videos being shown this week may contain images of um, deceased Aboriginal leaders and people. So just be aware of that. I know that that's a sensitive topic, and hopefully, this is enough of a warning for you to make peace with it, I guess, before you have to watch. There are two videos I'm going to ask you, I think it's only two videos I'm going to ask you to watch this week, for this lesson, sorry. Okay, so the first one is here, The Stolen Generation. The link is down here if this doesn't work on your one. We're not going to watch this together. There's no point. I'll just get you to pause the video while you go watch that and then come back. So, week 3, lesson 2. What is the stolen generation? Between 1910 and the 1970s, many First Nation children were forcibly removed from their families as a result of various government policies. The last official stories of Indigenous children being taken from their homes was only 50 years ago. Watch the following video to understand the Australian policies, the people responsible for the stolen generation, and how it impacted Indigenous communities. So you can pause the video here while you go and watch this video. Okay, I hope that was a little bit interesting for you, and we're going to move on to the next slide. We were told last lesson that Ali Cobby Eckermann was part of the stolen generation. There are many stories of survivors from this part of Australian history. Watch the video and then answer the questions on the following slide. So just watch this video. Again, the link is down here if you need it. And I'll get you to pause the video now while you go watch. Okay, on to the next slide. So after watching that video, we're going to answer these questions. So why was Sheila Humphreys in the orphanage? Remember, she explains in the beginning why she was in the orphanage, that she did have a mother, but her mother wanted her to get something special out of being at the orphanage. That's why she was there. Who removed her from the orphanage and why? Why was she forced to go back? What work did the girls in the orphanage do? You can just list them because I know there's a couple. What happened when her sister was badly burnt? Is this the correct way to treat a burn? So when her and her sister were working in the steam press, I believe, for sheets, they showed us this giant machine that they would feed the sheets through to dry them, and it was very, very hot. And sometimes the sheets would get stuck. And one of the other girls didn't realize that her sister's hand was actually in the machine, and she closed it, and so she got third-degree burns all the way up her arm. The nurses, or I should say the nuns that run the orphanage, did something to try and treat the burn, I guess. And we're told several times during that video that they were never taken to see doctors no matter what happened. So just think about when you get a sunburn and you're sitting in the sun, how does that feel? And now imagine putting butter on it. Do you think that's the correct way to treat a burn? Just let me know what you think. Next is, how did the nuns treat their feet when they were infected? How often did the girls in the orphanage bathe? And how many sets of clothes did they own? What food were the girls in the orphanage given? She does give a couple of examples there, so make sure you list them. How were the girls from the orphanage punished if they messed up their papers during lessons? How did Indigenous women give birth in the hospital? So she tells the story of how she gave birth to her own children when she was in the hospital. And she tells you where she was as compared to a white woman in the exact same hospital. And the last question was, how old were Sheila's children when the police attempted to take them away? So Sheila tells us this story about how she was put into a hospital to have her children, or have her child, I should say. And then she was left in there for 2 weeks, which is very, very odd. Even back in those times, you weren't left in hospital for very long unless there was an issue with the child. Now, she started to get concerned because she knew that while there wasn't an issue with her child, there was a general issue with the idea of Indigenous women being able to keep their children. She is part of the stolen generation, and she was afraid that this was going to happen to her, that her children would be taken off her. So she was kept in hospital for an extended period of time, and then I want to say about 2 weeks. And then not only did a nurse show up, but the police showed up with that nurse and explained that we don't think that you'll be able to take care of this child. So if Sheila was in hospital for 2 weeks before this incident happened, how old were her children before the police and the government tried to intervene and take them away? And this wasn't that long ago. Remember, the stolen generation, the last families to be affected by the stolen generation were in the 70s. It was 50 years ago. Your parents were alive during this time. Or maybe your grandparents. I forget how young some of you are. Okay, so that's the questions for that video. Moving on to the next one. Okay, so I just need you to read this along with me. So, the impact. The stolen generations have had devastating impacts for the people who were forcibly removed as children, their parents and families, and their descendants. All three of these groups experience high rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and suicide, and poor health and socio-economic outcomes. Stolen generation survivors, their families, and descendants have experienced greater disadvantage than both non-Indigenous Australians and other First Nation people who were not removed. So those people that were taken away from their families actually had a worse life than those people that got to stay with their families. For the people who were taken as children, this is what happened to those people that were directly impacted. Like as children, they were taken away from their families. Many were psychologically, physically, and sexually abused while living in state care and or with their adopted families, leading to lifelong trauma. Um, Ali Copy Ackerman actually says that this is what happened to her. Even though her family was nice and safe and the people that took care of her were good people, there was a family friend who sexually assaulted her when she was younger. This, unfortunately, is not a one-off story. A lot of people had to deal with this kind of abuse. Efforts to make stolen children reject their culture often create a sense of shame about being Indigenous heritage. This resulted in a disconnection from culture and an inability to pass culture on to their children. Many children were wrongly told that their parents were abusive, had died, or had abandoned them. Many never knew where they were taken from or who their biological families were. Living conditions in the institutions were highly controlled, and children were frequently punished harshly, were cold and hungry, and received minimal, if any, affection. Now, not to get too hard into the psychology of this, but the way that we behave as adults is all formed when we are children. The way we're treated in those first 5 to 6 years of our lives is so important when it comes to how we as adults and young people react to things in our world. So if these people are taken away from somewhere where they are loved, put in with a whole bunch of other kids who have also been stolen from people that they love, and forced to work in these back-breaking labours with no affection, were constantly cold and hungry, did not understand what good treatment was, we can just imagine what kind of people this could produce. If you don't know how to feel content in your own life, you find it very hard as you get older to find contentment. And the last dot point here is the children generally received very low level of education as they were expected to work as manual labourers and domestic servants. This has had lifelong economic implications. It means many who are now parents are unable to assist their children with schoolwork and education. So when these people were taken, they were basically going to be used as slaves. The Black Lives Matter movement in America is not just an American issue. It is very much an Australian issue in how we deal with our Indigenous people. These people were taken from their families. They were taught the bare minimum in actually how to do schoolwork, like reading and writing and math. And they were taught instead how to cook and clean and take care of other people. And then they would be sold off very cheaply to people who needed servants. And then they would be paid very little. For those people that weren't even 18 yet, their money would go straight into a bank account that was controlled by the government. So they didn't even see any money on. They couldn't spend their money the way they liked it because the government decided that Indigenous people couldn't take care of their own financial matters. And up here, I just wanted to, where was it? This one. Many never knew where they were taken from or who their biological families were. When we learnt about Ali Cobby Ackerman earlier this week, we found out she started looking for her mum when she was 19. She found her mum when she was 34. That's how long it took for her to find the woman who gave birth to her. It shouldn't be that hard. And it was only because the government decided to put a whole bunch of names together to make this sort of reconciliation easier that she was able to find her mum. So people that didn't have those resources before would live and die without knowing who their biological family is and what does it mean to be part of that family. Moving on, for the parents and family members of children who were taken, so this is for the people that were left behind after the kids were taken. Many parents never recovered from the grief of having their children removed. Some parents couldn't go on living without their children, while others turned to alcohol as a coping mechanism. And many siblings were separated. Many First Nation peoples are still searching for their parents and siblings. So, just because you were taken with your brother and sister doesn't mean you got to stay with your brother and sister. They would separate you as much as they could because they wanted you to feel lost and alone and give in to the way that they thought you should be raised. Now, for the descendants of the stolen generation, so this isn't the people that were directly stolen. This is instead um, the impact over several generations, even. So, for the descendants of members of the stolen generation, the removal of several generations of children severely disrupted the passing on of Indigenous cultures, and consequentially, many cultural knowledges have been lost or lay dormant. You probably don't even think about what you learned from your parents. I know that my music tastes, like when I listen to some songs, I'm like, oh, I know I like that because that's my mum's favorite band, or that kind of reminds me of my dad. I played cricket when I was younger because my dad was really into the cricket. The way you speak, the food you like, the songs you sing, the even who gets to say hip hip hooray at the end of a birthday. You know when you sing happy birthday, and then one person will go hip hip, and everyone goes hooray. The person who gets to go hip hip, that is normally something that is passed down generation to generation. In my house, it's my dad. If my dad's not there, it's me. I don't know why I got that role. But it's something that you learn because your parents taught it to you. You learn when to say please and thank you. You learn how to emote to people. So when you're upset, the way that you react when you're upset is because your parents taught you things. The way you cook is because your parents taught you foods that you like, foods you don't like. Um, I'm sure a lot of you guys go to Mexican restaurants and you don't really get the hot chili because your parents don't like the hot chili, so you never really got a palate for it. There's so many things we learn that we don't realize come from where we're from, come from our family, our friends, or that. So when generations are pulled apart the way the stolen generation was, um, it can be very hard for Indigenous cultures to survive. During the time of before colonialism, so before Cook came and settled and all that stuff, there were many, many different groups of Indigenous people in Australia. And they all had their own sort of language. I think at one point there was like 52 different languages being spoken in Australia by the Indigenous people. Some of them were very similar, some of them were very different, depending on where you live. And even now we have that sort of different way of speaking between states. We call them swimmers. When you go to the beach, you're wearing your swimmers. Melbourne calls them bathers. We call them potato scallops. You know those thin scallops that are dipped and deep fried. And Melbourne calls them potato fritters. So, because so many people were living in a country that was a very big country and they didn't all speak to each other, there were many different ways of existing on that bit of land. They had different ways of hunting and gathering. They had different religious ceremonies. They had different ways of clothing. They had different ways of talking. The way that they greeted each other was different. Sorry. And all of that was lost because the kids weren't there to pick it up. And so elders would die without being able to pass it on. So much of what we know about Indigenous cultures is barely scratching the surface of what it actually meant to be an Indigenous person in Australia. Okay, sorry, moving on. People who were removed as children were often deprived of living in a healthy family situation and prevented from learning parenting skills. In some instances, this has resulted in generations of children being raised in state care. Some people and organizations call this the new stolen generation. So if you were raised in, like I told you, you learn so many psychological things when you're in those really young beginning years. If you are not raised in a healthy family situation where you know who you can get support from, when people love you for who you are, all that kind of positive stuff, if that doesn't exist, you grow up and you don't know how to be a parent. You don't know how to look after people because no one looked after you. So what you think is okay, which is bathing once a week in water that 5 other people have bathed in, and only owning one outfit that you wore all the time, unless you're going to church, that's what you would do to your own children. You would have your own children, and you would only have one bath a week, and you wouldn't brush their hair and take care of them. Sorry, that's just my dog. um, oh my goodness, let's get back to this. This is what I was doing. Okay, so if you couldn't take care of your children, then the government would step in and say, you're not a fit parent, I'm going to give these children to someone else. And this is what the new stolen generation is. This is thousands and thousands and thousands of people not being taught how to look after themselves, let alone other people, and then the government stepping in and saying, you are an unfit mother. The last dot point is many are still experiencing intergenerational trauma that results when the effects of trauma are passed down to the next generation. So, a little bit of a story time. My mum was raised in foster care, and when she was 17, she was a ward of the state, is what they called it. She wasn't Indigenous. She was a ward of the state, and they found out, the government, found out she was pregnant, and they were like, 17-year-olds can't have babies. And so she was forced to have an abortion. Now, after so when she got pregnant again when she was 18, she was so afraid that someone would come and take her baby again, that she went and hid up in Dubbo with my father's extended family, hoping that they wouldn't find her up there, which they didn't. My older sister was born and everything was fine. Now, this is a story I've been raised on that I've been told a lot of times. And even though I know that there are extra circumstances around it, my mum was a ward of the state, she didn't have a strong family that could help her and protect her when she was 17, it still makes me anxious every time any sort of official comes and knocks on my door, because I'm so scared that the government's going to come and tell me that I'm not a good mum. And so this is intergenerational trauma. I'm not telling it to you to make you feel sorry for me, and it's not a funny story or anything. It's just an example of how one thing that can hurt one person can then be passed on. And unfortunately, chances are, since I've also told this story to my son, and he's spoken to his grandma about it, and he's well aware of all that stuff with the government interfering, it might be something that he grows up and is afraid of. And so this is intergenerational trauma. This is something that is going to affect people from the stolen generations for years and years to come. Even though the laws are no longer there saying that they can forcibly take people out of their homes, the fear that the government can do this is still very real, especially for those people that went through it themselves. Okay, so I want you guys to write a summary of all the information about the stolen generation. You have a lot of information to go through. Okay, just a quick summary. What is the stolen generation? Who did it impact? Why did it happen? How was the government involved? Okay, and then I want you to use some evidence from Sheila's TED Talk. So that's this one here. Give me some details. So details could be they weren't left to live in good conditions, such as the food that they got to eat, the clothes they got to wear, how often they bathed, and all that stuff from Sheila's story. And that is the end of lesson 2. This painting is called Milky Way and the Seven Sisters by Long Rose. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!